welcome or welcome back. It's that time of year where we wrap up and talk about everything that we have done. And I'm ready to talk about what I have read this year. Now, I posted a resolution on my Instagram with like little wrap ups of what I've read, but I haven't gone into the in-depth data. And I also have read more since I posted that wrap up, and I probably will read more after this one. But it is Christmas, and I don't think I'm going to be reading any more books over the next 6 days, at least not more than one or two. So I think we're safe to talk about exactly what I've read thus far. So let's jump into the statistics. So in 2024, so far, I've read 60 books. Now, my original goal was 70 books, so I'm 10 short. But I didn't read a lot of the months of this year, so I'm not too upset about not reaching that goal. I am going to keep the goal the same thing next year because I do know for a fact that I am capable of reading 70 books in a year. I just didn't do it this year. My average rating for the books that I read was 3.5. The average page count of the books that I've read is 323. And the average time it took me to read a book was 9.26 days. Now, the longest it took me to read a book was 98 days. And that was an ARC read, so that's actually really bad. But it was really hard for me to get into the book. So, I don't know, I just couldn't. I had to keep putting it down and picking up other things because it was putting me in a reading slump. So, yeah, it took me 98 days to finish that book. And then there's about 4 or 5 books that I've read within like a day or the same day, and mostly it's been this past week because I've been reading a lot of Christmas books, and I started so late that I've been just like rapidly reading them to just try and get through them as soon as possible. So in regards to genre, I said I wanted to read less romance and I did not listen. So next year I will be reading less romance, but this year I read 41% of the books I read were romance. Which isn't as bad as it was last year, but that's still a lot. 16% were fantasy, 13% were nonfiction. My highest number after romance was general fiction or literary fiction. I didn't really know what category to put it in, but that was 19%. And then the only other genre other than fantasy / romantasy was horror, which was like 5. Now, method-wise, this is probably the most shocking thing for me. 36% of my reading was audiobooks, which is insane because I don't really like audiobooks that much. But I know this happened because I got into knitting this year. So I spent a ridiculous amount of time knitting and listening to audiobooks. So yeah, 36% of the books that I inhaled this year were through audio. Then another 36% were through Kindle, which I'm not surprised by because I got a Kindle last year for Christmas and I got Kindle Unlimited, and it's just so easy to find so many books, especially romances, on Kindle Unlimited by independent authors that I really wanted to read. So I spent a lot of time reading Kindle, and then I only read about 27% of paperback books, which I do want to up next year, mostly because I want to start working through my TBR instead of buying books, which brings me to the next thing. As I was saying, I was reading a lot of books on Kindle Unlimited. So 35% of the books that I read were on Kindle Unlimited. Then let's not discuss this, but 33% were new purchases made this year. 10% were from my TBR, which is awful. That's not a lot at all, but at least some. And then 16% were from Everand, which is this app that I use mostly for audiobooks. And then I had a few ARCs, like 3% of them were ARCs. So honestly, I understand how the numbers are the numbers that they are, but next year I need my TBR to at least be 25%. I can't have new purchases be that big again. I need to not purchase as many books next year to read. There are a few that I've already pre-ordered, and I'm not considering those, well, they are new purchases, but I'm not holding those against me because they're coming out next year. But I will not just be purchasing any book. I will be avoiding Book Outlet. And yeah, well, that's what that is. So this next one, I'm not surprised by at all. I kind of already knew this, but I thought it was really interesting and something I have to consider if I want to branch outside of. But 93% of the authors that I read were women, and only 3% were genderqueer people, and then I think like 4% were male authors. I'm not surprised by that, especially because I mostly read romance. So I'm not surprised that the majority of the books I read were by women authors. But I feel like since next year I'm going to try and branch out of romance a little bit more and read more thriller and horror and literary fiction, I'll probably read a lot more male authors during that time. But yeah, no, I'm not surprised that I mostly only read books written by women. I find that those are the ones I resonate with most, and I'm not gonna lie to you, I don't know if there are romances that I want to read that are written by men, because I don't think most men understand what we want in real life. So I don't think they'd understand what we want in a fictional world. But I'm not slamming at all men who write romance. I have not read any romance books written by men, so I can't say what the quality is. I'm just saying it's not something I'm very interested in exploring. So next, breaking it down by race. So this is also not surprising, but 61% of the books I read were by Black authors. But this part kind of surprised me. 20% of the books I read were by white authors. And I understand why, because there are certain perspectives that I look for in regards to like the LGBTQIA plus community and plus size books. Those books I'll branch out and read a white author, but it's very rare that I choose to read a white author who isn't offering some sort of representation or diversity, if it's about disability or mental health, or like I said, plus size or the queer community. Those things I love reading about, so I don't mind picking up a white author. But if it's just a book about two white people falling in love or something along those lines, it doesn't interest me at all. Now, I don't know how I feel that way about thrillers and horrors and things like that, but it's just mostly because I mostly read romance. I did not expect there to be so many white authors on that. Next was Asian authors, which I'm not surprised about because of Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month. I made it a goal of mine to read books from a lot of different Asian cultures and countries, so I'm not surprised that that number is as high as it is. I kind of wish it was a little bit higher, but that's how I feel about every kind of grouping, because as much as I love Black authors, I want to read perspectives outside of the one that I live. So I think that's something I'm going to focus on next year as well. 5% were Indigenous authors, and I think that's because I read the Halfling Saga, 2 books of it, and then I read To Shape a Dragon's Breath, so that resulted in me adventuring into those stories a little bit more, and I loved it. The 4th book of the Halfling Saga is coming out next year, which I pre-ordered, and I already have the 3rd book, so I probably will be reading more Indigenous authors next year. Plus, there's a few memoirs that I have from Indigenous authors that I want to definitely check out as well. And then in regards to representation, 33% of my books did not have a representation outside of the other categories. Like, that doesn't speak to race or gender or anything like that, or cultures or anything like that. It's mostly speaking to things outside of those things, like disability, mental health, neurodiverse, refugee, LGBTQIA, plus size. Those were the representation categories I was looking at. So only 33% of them had none of those. The next highest one was the LGBTQIA plus, which was 21%, which is also not surprising because I read a huge amount of books during Pride Month, and in general I enjoy reading queer stories. As a bisexual, I like reading sapphic stories. As someone a part of the community, I really enjoy reading the other stories. Like, something I really want to focus on in 2025 is reading more books about genderqueer and trans people and their experiences and their love stories and things along those lines. So I'm not surprised by that number, and I'm really hoping to increase it. The next highest one was mental health. About 11% of the books that I read had mental health representation, which I also want to up that one too. When I was younger, I used to like when I was younger and I undiagnosed, I used to seek out books about mental health because I was trying to understand myself. And now that I'm a little bit older, I want to see that representation in other people, like other races, because the majority of the books when I was growing up in like the early 2000s were from the perspective of white teenagers. Perks of Being a Wallflower, it's kind of a funny story. Suicide Notes, like I can name a bunch of mental, like fiction books with characters with mental health issues that are from that specific perspective. So I want to branch out and see more of them, and even some memoirs. So that's something I want to grow as well. After that, it was neurodiverse, autistic, ADHD, things along those lines, then disability, and then stories about refugee or immigrants. And then 15% of the books I read were about plus size people. I also want to up that as somebody who writes plus size romances and fantasies eventually. I, of course, want to check out the people who do the same thing that I do so that I can support them, so I can see the books that are in the subgenre that I exist in. As well, I also just enjoy reading books about plus size people falling in love and going on journeys. I think I have to read more books. I don't know if there's a lot, but I would like to read more books with plus size main characters who are not just in a romance. Like, I think it'd be really cool to read a thriller or horror or something along those lines where the character is plus size, but it's not necessarily relevant, they're just existing. Like, that's something I want from plus size representation. I just want to see us existing. I don't want it to be like a plot device or integral to their journey. I just want to see us be people that are in stories. And I think that's something I do with my own writing. While being plus size, obviously you can't walk throughout the world without it affecting you or being brought up, but that's not the focal point of my stories. The focal point of my stories is that we exist and we're doing things while we exist. Now, the last category of what I was looking at is what were my main characters. And like when I did this chart this year, I didn't think about character mixes like black woman, white man, or white woman, black man, or anything like that. I only thought about people of color and white characters. And so 78% of the books that I read, the main characters were BIPOC, and then 21% of the books I read, the main characters were white. So majority wise, I read characters that are part of the BIPOC community, and then there's this percentage that was reading characters who are white, which is great. I don't want to not read books about white people. I just don't want it to be the main thing that I read. But I think the majority of those, like I said, were in some sort of representation, like they were part of the queer community or plus size or mental health. It wasn't just, you know, cis white heteronormative women and men doing what they do. So that's the breakdown of what I read and how I read it. And now I want to talk about my 5-star reads. So my 5-star reads this year have mostly, if all, been romance except for one. And surprisingly, well, not surprisingly, lovingly and happily, my #1 read of the year was not a romance book, which is just a reminder to me that I need to read more outside of that genre. But my 5-star books were Some Kind of Forever by Lena James, 7 Days in June by Tia Williams, A Girl Like Her by Talia Hibbert, Daughter of the Pirate King by Trisha Levenseller, and then This Could Be Us by Kennedy Ryan. And then my #1 book of the year was The Bandit Queens by Parini Schroff. That book changed my life. That book became a personality for me. The deep dive I did into the Indian caste system because of that book was absolutely wild. And I just am so interested in the history of India now because of that book. So that is my #1 read of the year. And if there's any book that I think you should read in 2025, it is that one. Especially if you're looking for a book that is from the point of view of women while showing not only their friendship and community with one another, but their strength through the challenges that they face. When I think about the song Labor, I feel like it was made specifically for the women in the Bandit Queens. So 10 out of 10, that's the top book. You have to read that book. I can talk for days about that book, but that was my #1 book of the year. Now, I know what you're thinking. That's not a lot of 5-star reads. So you must not have really enjoyed the books you read this year, but that's not true. A lot of the books I read were 4.5 stars. There were some that were ranked really low, but a good portion of them were 4.5 stars. The reason they weren't 5 stars was because I just didn't love them the way I loved the books that I gave 5 stars to. So there are a lot of books that I really enjoyed. There were some books I did not enjoy, but for the most part, the year overall was really good. So summing up this year, I honestly have to say that it was a reminder to me of how much I love reading. Like, reading was harder. I had a lot of struggles that I were going through this year with my health and my cat and my finances, and there was a lot of reasons where I was very stressed out, including a job that was really bad for me. So I didn't want to read as much. Sometimes I just wanted to disassociate and just lay in a puddle watching reality TV. But every time I picked up a book, it reminded me how much I love books. So I just really can't wait to continue to love books in 2025 and to just grow in my reading experience. So with that said, my goals in 2025 are as follows. I want to read only 30% romance. I want the other categories to grow more and there to be less romance. And because of that, the first 2 months of the year, I'm going to try not to read any romance books. I can't promise that I won't read any romance books, but I'm going to try not to read any romance books. And I'm going to really try and focus on thrillers and fantasies because I really like the fantasies I read this year. And I have a bunch of thrillers sitting on my shelf that I haven't gotten to. The next thing is I'm going to keep my goal of 70 books the same. I think the fact that there was like 4 months this year that I didn't read any books and I still got to like 61 books, 60 books, is actually really impressive. And it shows me that I could probably, if I were keeping up with reading, get to like 100. So we're going to just set the goal for 70 and see what we're able to accomplish. My next goal is to read more outside of my own perspective. I love reading Black authors and I will 10 times down always support Black authors, but I also want to read more from other ethnicities and groupings and cultures so that I can learn more and grow more as a person and be able to connect with humans on a different level. Another goal of mine is to read more male authors. I love women. I support women. I support women's rights. I support women's wrongs. I love reading our female rage. I love reading our sadness. I love reading our redemption arcs. I love stories about women. But I don't want to be missing out on anything. So I'm going to try to get the male author up to 10%. It doesn't seem like a lot, but from 4%, that's a huge jump. And then genderqueer authors, I would love to be like 15% because I think out of all of the people in the alphabet gang, I know the least amount about genderqueer people. So I would love to learn more about their experiences. And my last goal is to tackle 25% of my TBR, at least, and just not purchase new books as much. I can't say I'm not going to purchase at all. I'm not going to lie to you, okay? But I'm going to try not to purchase that much. So those are my goals for 2025. This is a wrap up for 2024. I look forward to sharing so many more vlogs and wrap ups with you and just continuing to discuss books. And I got to 100 subscribers, so I am so happy for the community that we are building, especially for readers and writers. Like, I'm so excited about that. So I can't wait. I can't wait. But thank you so much for watching. If this is your first video, if you've watched multiple videos, thank you so much for watching. And I cannot wait to see you in the new year.